Hi, my name is Scotty Kessler, and this is the first class session under the name of the course called Competing Biblically. This is all under the umbrella of the West Neal School of Sports Ministry. We're going to take some time to lay this out thoroughly and simply in both the description of the class and also the background to the school. Competing biblically, we want to describe, as we always do, the what and the why and the how of anything that we're attempting to teach or articulate. The what of competing biblically, it is by just statement. It's what does it look like to compete biblically? There's lots of philosophies out there in the world by legitimate, sincere, professing believers, philosophies of competition, the way to approach sport mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. There's lots of options out there. We have what we consider to be a distinctive. It is a way to think about competition. It is not necessarily the way. It is the way for us, and it's the approach we're going to take at the School of Sports Ministry. There will be distinctives affiliated with two of the patriarchs in our country, in the United States, though we believe this has international implications. It happens to come from our particular turf, which is the U.S. One patriarch's name is Wes Neal. He's the name of the founding of the school. He has the naming rights, so to speak, of the school, and I'll describe him, my relationship with him as the director of the School of Sports Ministry. And secondly, Frosty Westering is another name that will be thrown around a lot, and much of the core foundational thinking comes through the root of his a particular philosophy of competition. There's many names for what we're going to talk about. Some people, I call it competing biblically. I'll describe why I developed that particular name. Some people call it more than winning. Frosty would be one who that fell into that category. He called it more than champions, more than winning, make the big time where you're at. Wes Neal called it total release performance. Some people call it competing upside down, and there are many ways to articulate it based on their own personality or the frame of reference or the particular culture that they've created. However it's developed, they have similar threads and foundational core beliefs, and we want to share them from our perspective at Faith International University and Seminary with the West Neal School of Sports Ministry. If the what is competing biblically, the why is that we believe sport is one of the very few and powerful international languages, meaning every country in the world has some kind of sport context. And music is another example of that. Every country in the world, every culture has a music component to it. And so if there are universal languages that would be worthwhile as we desire to advance the kingdom, and in this case, advance the kingdom through sport, it'd be worthwhile for us to have a conviction, to be humble about our conviction, to have a conviction. We've talked about that in other classes in the School of Discipleship. It's important to have a conviction and also to be humble about it. If you have a conviction without humility, that's arrogant. If you have humility without conviction, you'll just waffle around. You won't be able to lead. You won't pioneer. You won't be able to penetrate the darkness with the light of the gospel of Jesus. The phrase competing biblically, I developed for my own thinking because, there's two categories of people in the world. There's the lost and the saved. There's two categories of people, those that need evangelism, that's the lost, and those that need to grow as learners and followers, that's the saved. That would be evangelism and discipleship. That would be the lost and the saved. That would be light and darkness. We're not attempting to penetrate only the unbelieving world and use sport as an evangelistic tool. We also want to use it within the believing world as a discipleship tool, how to develop learners. So this isn't only about sport. This is about using sport to develop a philosophy of life, not just a philosophy of competition, a philosophy of life. And the transferability of the principles and the concepts and the truths of competing biblically is correlative to a lifestyle of living biblically. And so This is a lifestyle. It's the Great Commission lifestyle, and we have a competing biblically lifestyle. All of these things in our minds are integrated, and we want to teach as such. And so we'll roll back and forth in and out of sport into evangelism and into discipleship because they're all integrated. We talk about the integration of faith and sport, that sport is not a compartmentalized piece of our life. It's not something we do. It's who we are. We are sons and daughters of God. We're the children of God that are in the world, and we're in sport. Whether we're coaching it, whether we're playing it, whether we're watching it, the statistics in America are incredible of the amount of people that have an interaction with the concept of sport. Again, observing it, attending it, having children that are in it, having relationships with others that are in it, our own affinities, our play and coaching of it. In so many ways, people rub sport, that whether they ever played it or coached it, they have interactions with it. All those people are possibly going to be impacted by whatever philosophy you hold in terms of how you approach sport and how you integrate sport and your faith. I will need to give my personal testimony of my journey in addition, so you can understand where I'm coming from. As a professor in the School of Sports Ministry and a director of the Greater School of Sports Ministry here at Faith, it's important for you to know the what, why, and how of my process, because then it'll help you understand what I'm attempting to articulate. The reason, again, that we developed the concept of what we call competing biblically and that distinctive is I found that as we were in the world attempting to play and coach sports, that we found there are so many different variations of philosophies about sport, and we felt strongly that it needed to pass biblical muster, that as we vetted our play and our coaching, as we ran it through this filter, if it wasn't biblical, then it wasn't acceptable. And we needed to be very firm along that line because philosophies bleed together where they lose their distinctiveness. In our distinctiveness and a distinctiveness in the philosophy of competing biblically that sets it apart both obviously from the world and also within the spectrum of legitimate Jesus confessors. The distinctiveness of competing biblically is really twofold. One is how they approach the scoreboard, or they approach the concept of winning and losing. And the secondly is how they address the actual play itself, how they address the opponent and the referees. Those are the distinctives within the philosophy in our experience. When it boils down to what sets this philosophy apart, again, not better or worse, just different than other philosophies within the spectrum of those that confess Jesus' name and are playing and coach sports, the differentiation is, again, how they treat the scoreboard and the concept of winning and losing, and how they treat the opponent and the referees within the sport actual game itself, whatever it might be. Those would be the ways that as time goes on here, you'll see the difference and the distinctiveness. Very important, I'm going to reiterate this, that you understand this isn't the way for everybody. It's our conviction. We want to be humble about it to say there's many ways to approach it. There's many biblical ways to approach it. We simply call it competing biblically because we want to make sure at every juncture, in every part of the process of sport, play and coaching, observation, articulation, that if it's not biblical, or to make sure it's not unbiblical. There's lots of room in the middle of that, and that's why we want to say there's lots of room for alternative philosophies. But we would contend, if you confess Jesus' name, what you do and what you say needs to be biblical, or at least it needs to not be unbiblical. And within those framework, within those boundaries, there's much variation. There's many opportunities for differing views. We agree to disagree with all people that confess His name and that walk in obedience to Him, who have a philosophy that may be a little bit different or a lot different than ours. In particular, how you treat the scoreboard and the concept of winning and losing, how you treat the opponent, and how you treat the referees. There is tremendous disagreement about that. And we need to be not disagreeable, even as we may disagree in both concept and practice. And it all tends to show up, as we talk about, mostly on game day, within the game day setting is when our heart smokes out. What is our attitude toward winning and losing? What is our attitude to our opponent and the referees? It's all nice in the classroom setting, but until it goes out into the grass or the court or the mat, that's when the rubber meets the road in terms of where people are at, because you rub against their flesh, their own desires, their goals, their agenda. Is it about our will or is it about God's will? Whose will do we want done? What is the process like? The end may be fit, but if the process is unbiblical, then that doesn't matter what the end is. The end and the means have to be biblical, not just the end biblical, not just the means biblical. And the problem lies, in my experience, within those that confess His name, is at the end of the day, they feel good about an outcome, that it's biblical because they pray after the game or they acknowledge God after the game, but the process may be completely unbiblical in their attitude or their speech or their behavior. That would be unacceptable to us within the spectrum of our articulation of this philosophy. So as I went personally around the country working with teams and coaches and players around this philosophy, I found that to use a title or an articulation competing biblically was helpful because it brought us back to the main point in that articulation, and that is it has to be biblical or at least cannot be unbiblical as it plays out. And thus, I created this phrase called competing biblically versus other Christian philosophies that may not be biblical in their process, even though their outcome may be God-honoring because they thanked God for the win, and sometimes, though rarely, thanked Him for the loss. That's part of the conundrum or the battle in the philosophy, is what is our will versus what is God's will. And trusting that He will use all things, even suffering situations, primarily suffering situations, to glorify His name. So, the what, competing biblically. Why? Because we want to make sure we're obedient in every regard, whether it's in sport or in life. How to do it is where the tricky part comes. How has to do with the play, has to do with the performance, has to do with the process, and that's where it's difficult. We can have people that agree on the what, and they agree on the why, but in the how and the practice is where the rubber meets the road. And in a classroom setting, obviously, we're not performing. We're not playing nor coaching, not observing competition. So in that sense, it's all hypothetical, but there's power in words. We have to have a starting point. We have to have a frame of reference. We have to have some kind of verbal or written articulation that we can go to review what we just saw, to see if it passes muster, to see if it can be vetted. And that's also part of this class, as we're trying to move it from the classroom to the field of sport. But this is an academic institution. This is a class. This is a university credit or master's level postgrad or undergrad credit. And so at some point we have to deal with it in a classroom setting. But our goal is to have it translate to action. Otherwise, that would be an inadequate articulation. So this has to do with the what, why, and how. This has to do with concepts, has to do with articulations, has to do with practice. I don't mean practices, but the practice or the playing out of this in actual competition. All these things we wish to address.